Welcome to Chinese Religion Part 11. This video covers the religion, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism during the Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties. The Song dynasty was another long-lasting, stable dynasty that had a big influence on later Chinese culture and religion, similar to the Han and the Tang that had come before. During the Song, Buddhism mainly survived in the three schools of Chan, Pure Land, and Tiantai, because the Emperor Wu Zong of Tang had persecuted Buddhism, and the schools or the sects of Buddhism that survived tended to be those that were easy to practice by people, even without large libraries of sutras or institutions in capitals or important cities. So Chan with its focus on meditation, and Pure Land and Tiantai with its focus on chanting mantras, it was easy for people to practice, including lay people could continue to recite mantras, for instance, even without regular access to a monk. Taoism was no longer the state religion during the Song, so it did not at all die out, but it didn't have the same prominence that it had during the Tang dynasty. Confucianism was revived during the Song dynasty. This type of Confucianism, which combined some new ideas with it, is called Neo-Confucianism by Western scholars, but it's known among Chinese as Song, Ming, Rujia, or the Confucianism of the Song and Ming dynasties. So the Yuan dynasty basically was a period of foreign rule in China. Mongols under Kublai Khan, the successor to Genghis Khan, conquered China and ruled for almost a century. They established Vajrayana Buddhism as the state religion. That was the type of Buddhism practiced in Mongolia. However, they also supported Orthodox unity Taoism, or Chengyi Dao, and this was in part a way of adopting themselves to Chinese culture. So they didn't want to just come across as foreign barbarians who had no respect for Chinese practices and institutions. So they also supported the Taoist clergy, similar to their support under the Tang dynasty by the emperors then. The Ming dynasty was established by Chu Yuanchang after he overthrew the Mongols, and so this reestablished rule by ethnic Han Chinese in China. Songming Confucianism, or Songming Rujia, sought to revive Confucianism because it had gone into relative decline with respect to Buddhism and Taoism during the Tang dynasty. Nevertheless, this revived form of Confucianism, which also sought to broaden its appeal both among the common people and among scholars, combined some ideas from Taoism and Buddhism into Confucianism. Chou Junyi was the founder of Songming Rujia, and an example of the Taoist influence was the emphasis on the Great Ultimate, or Daiji, as a first principle and source of all phenomena. Now, this was not the first time that Confucian scholars had taken ideas from yin-yang cosmology, which also had an influence on Taoism, but the degree of emphasis, engaging in sustained metaphysical speculation about the source and origin of the cosmos, this was not something that had been done by earlier generations of Confucian scholars. If you look at before the Han Dynasty, people like Confucius himself, like Mengzi, Xunzi, they mainly focused on morality and politics and the sort of practice of ritual or customs. This was in the Songming Rujia, they had a higher place for metaphysical speculation, such as the origin of things, a kind of first principle of being and becoming, kind of partially standing in for the role that God plays in monotheistic religions was Daiji. Another practice that entered into Confucianism at this time was quiet sitting. This was a meditation practice that was clearly influenced by both Taoist and Buddhist meditation. The idea was that this could be part of the training for someone to become a junzi, but Confucius himself, if you read the Analects, the Lun Yu, he actually doesn't recommend meditation. He seems to have been aware of it, perhaps early forms of Taoist meditation, but he says that he tried sitting still for a day and he felt like he had just wasted his time. He should have spent it in learning instead. But you can see these later Song Ming Dynasty Confucians had a different approach. Another important Song Ming Confucian was Chu Shi. So he advocated studying the four books, as he called them, before the five classics. The five classics were still regarded as the heart of the Confucian curriculum, necessary for your training if you were to become a junzi. However, because they were so old and they were things that were hard to understand without a lot of background and historical context provided to you by commentaries or teachers, he recommended four other texts as useful preliminaries to studying the five classics. These were the Great Learning, the Analects or Lun Yu, the Mencius or Meng Tse, and the Doctrine of the Mean or Chong Yong. So the Analects was recorded sayings of Confucius. Mencius or Meng Tse was written by that Confucian scholar. The Great Learning was a chapter from a longer text that kind of gives the rationale for Confucian education. In a nutshell, the idea is if you want to transform human society and indeed create harmony in the whole cosmos, the way you do that is by starting to learn on your own, cultivating virtue for yourself, and then that good influence will sort of percolate out from yourself to wider and wider spheres as you perfect your learning and your virtue. And then the doctrine of the mean is a summary of the Confucian idea of balancing conflicting considerations and kind of a harmony that you can cultivate as a junzi or as an educated scholar. So Chu Shi's approach to Confucianism is called Li Shui, or the school of principle, Li. So Li means principle, Shui means learning. Li in the Confucian context means the nature or principle that underlies reality. This is a kind of blueprint, you could think of it as, or an architecture of the cosmos that ultimately you could trace back to heaven or Dai Chi. And the idea of Chu Shi is that we have a kind of internal moral principle in us that reflects this heavenly principle. And this principle is always good. However, we're also given at birth a mixture of qi or energy, different types of qi that correspond to different emotions. And we all have this sort of individual personality or psychological profile given to us at birth with our composition of qi. And this kind of gets back to Meng Tse's idea of having to train your qi, your vital energy, or even your psychological forces in order to become virtuous. But the idea of Chu Shi is he's ultimately pretty optimistic. We have this objectively correct, infallible moral principle within us. We just need to learn how to train our feelings to match, go along with, and support that heavenly principle. Another really important Song Ming Confucian was Wang Yang Ming. He had a teaching called the School of the Heart Mind, or Xin Shui. According to this teaching, the moral sense, this is your sense of right and wrong, your moral guide, is innate in your heart or your mind, Xin, and takes precedence over your learning, or Shui. So this is somewhat surprising from a Confucian context because Wang Yang Ming, like other Confucians, really did emphasize the value of learning, of education, of training yourself. But you can see this progress towards a more optimistic view of human nature. We can see the possible influence of the Buddhist notion of the Buddha nature, that your mind or consciousness is originally pure. You just have to get rid of those temporary things that defile and obscure the mind. Well, the Confucian version of that is that you have this innate moral goodness and moral sense or moral principle in your heart. And that's even more important than your learning. The learning is basically just helping you discover that, helping you reveal or support what is already there. Taoism also changed during the Song and Ming period, Song, Yuan, Ming. Now, we're using the term Song Ming in part because traditional Chinese historiography regards the Yuan dynasty or the rule of the Mongols as not an authentic or Chinese dynasty. But this period does cover that period of Mongol rule as well. So Chuan Chen is the school of complete truth in Taoism. It's another Taoist sect. This was founded by Wang Chongyang, and he advocates a form of Taoist monasticism modeled on that of Buddhism. In the Chuan Chen school, they have a teaching that you can totally transcend your body, attain a kind of spiritual transcendence. This is based on the earlier Taoist notions of transforming your Jing and Qi purely into Shen or spirit. So he did not teach physical immortality, immortality of the body, perhaps through outer alchemy, but rather an inner transformation that leads to a spiritual immortality and a transcending of the world as we know it. Interestingly, even though this was definitely a Taoist sect, Wang Chongyang advocated studying non-Taoist texts, specifically the Confucian classic of filiality and the Buddhist Heart Sutra. So this shows you the syncretic character of a lot of traditional Chinese religion. There weren't necessarily the views that there were these strict boundaries between religions and you should never combine them. A lot of Taoists, for instance, also believed that Confucian values and principles could guide your conduct with respect to your family and with respect to your role in government or just society generally. The Heart Sutra was a sutra from Chinese Buddhism, very important. It's just a short stanza. It's regarded by many Chinese Buddhists as summarizing the key wisdom and doctrine or dharma of the Buddha. So it's noteworthy that this text was also used in Chuanshen Taoism. So Wang Chongyang was also famous for his 7 chief disciples who were regarded as perfected beings or sages, Taoist sages, basically the Taoist equivalent of an enlightened person. And one of these was a woman, Sun Bu-er, and she was actually the wife of another one of Wang Chongyang's students, Ma Danyang. Sun Bu-er wanted to study the Taoism seriously, wanted to eventually become a sage if possible and a teacher on her own. Initially, Wang Chongyang did not let her do this, and her husband did not encourage it as well. Her husband, Ma Danyang, said, look, you're so beautiful that if you travel on your own, as you're planning to do, to go to another city to learn and teach, then you'll surely be accosted by ruffians. And he's basically talking about her being sexually assaulted. And so in order to get around this objection to her setting out on her own, Sun Bu-er actually heats oil, cooking oil, in a pan on her stove and then throws the boiling hot oil on her face and scars her face with burns. So this is maybe not a literally true story, I'm not totally sure on that, but it shows you the idea of the absolute commitment you need in order to become a Taoist perfected person, the idea that you should be willing to sacrifice physical beauty and adornments for the sake of this inner goal. That's ultimately what the story is symbolizing. After this show of willpower, determination, and dedication, Wang Chongyang does give her permission to set out on her own. She travels to this foreign city where it's just part of her plan to study and become a perfected person. And along the way, she is indeed accosted by ruffians, despite her previous disfigurement of her face. However, because of her mastery of the Tao, she's able to essentially use miraculous powers to overcome them. And she sets herself up in this other city, becomes a teacher on her own right. And this is kind of somewhat rare example of a really important, prominent female religious teacher in Taoism. It did not happen very often in Confucianism. It seems to have happened a bit more in Taoism. There were, after all, female Taoist nuns and priests, but this is one of the most famous examples of a Taoist female sage. This picture on the right is of a monastery of the Chuanshen sect in Wudongshan in Hubei. Wudongshan is one of the sacred mountains in China. Oftentimes you get both Buddhist and Taoist temples or monasteries built on these sacred mountains. Oftentimes their sacred status goes back to ancient times, even before Buddhism or even Taoism existed in some cases. So it's kind of like showing you the continuation of the traditions in Chinese religion and also the kind of mutual influence between the different religions that are practiced there. Another really important Taoist sect in the Song Ming period is Chengyi Dao, or Orthodox unity. So this was really raised to prominence during the Yuan Dynasty. Kublai Khan gave exclusive authority to the leader of this sect, Orthodox unity or Chengyi Dao. They regard themselves as the successors to Tianqi Dao, the way of the celestial masters, whose teaching or doctrine was called Chengyi Dao. And they retained their prominence among Taoist sects even today. They were the ones also who compiled the Taoist canon or Tao Song in 1445. So this is, you could think of it as kind of like a Taoist Bible, but the difference is the Taoist canon contains literally hundreds or thousands of texts. So it's very long. Even the printed versions, span to dozens of volumes. So it's really basically just a collection of many different Taoist texts authored over a long period. They don't have all the same significance in the religion. So for example, some of them are kind of technical treatises about alchemy or relatively obscure affairs. Others are classic texts like the Tao Te Ching and the Chuang Tzu, which also have a kind of religious status in religious or sectarian Taoism. So let's also talk about Buddhism during the Song and Ming dynasties. As I mentioned, a lot of the other Buddhist sects kind of died out. The ones that were maybe especially dependent on having sutra scholarship or being able to propagate themselves based on lay people interacting with monks in established temples, ones who were connected to the centers of power like the imperial government. There was a lot of official persecution, so the ones that survived tended to be sects of Buddhism that could be practiced somewhat anonymously and low profile in the country. And eventually the heat on Buddhism didn't last that long, but it was a kind of a filter or sifting process. And the main sects that emerged were Pure Land, Tiantai, and Shan. Now, Pure Land and Tiantai, in addition to being focused on mantra practice, so you just have your prayer beads, you can recite your mantras to Amitabha or to the Lotus Sutra, or pray to Guanyin. These are things that could be practiced easily by lay people without a lot of instruction by monks, and also by monks themselves. They could practice on their own if they had to, just as hermits in the mountains in the extreme case. Also, you have to keep in mind the popularity of these godlike divine figures of Amitabha or Amitabha Buddha. He's this kind of celestial being who rules in a pure land, a heaven-like realm, similar to the Western paradise of Shilong Mu in Taoism, or Guanyin, this goddess of compassion, who if you pray to her, she will help relieve your suffering. These were very meaningful and popular beings that you'd want to direct your worship to. And so they remained popular even today in Chinese Buddhism. Chan Buddhism was also easy to maintain because the focus was on the meditation practice. So people could sort of keep the flame going even if they were kicked out of their old monasteries. They could, worst case scenario, just meditate, as hermits in the mountains or whatever. However, there were traditionally 8 different schools of Chan Buddhism that had previously existed during the Tang. Only 2 of these survived, Linji and Saodong. These schools have a lot of differences, but the easy way of characterizing their differences is that the Linji focuses more on going on practice, and Saodong focuses more on sitting meditation practice, even though both of the sects do both. And basically what happened was these texts that had been originally authored during the Tang Dynasty, like Transmission of the Lamp and the Gong-On collections, were preserved, copied, transmitted during Song and Ming for later generations. The picture on the right is of a very famous pagoda, the Gai Feng, or Iron Pagoda. It's not literally made of iron, but that was built in 1049 in Gaifeng, China. This is built during the Song Dynasty, but it survives to this day. Another important figure in Songming Buddhism, not that well known or widely studied today, but Chu Hong, he's very interesting because his innovations to doctrine and practice really show you the way in which Buddhism was adapted to fit Chinese culture. So one of the things he did was he assigned actual point values to different actions. So you could kind of quantify, at least in principle, how much merit or demerit you would earn for different actions. And among other things, this could give you an idea of, okay, I committed this sin, I broke this precept, that cost me X number of demerit points. How much merit do I need to accumulate in order to counteract that? So that approach was pretty popular. He also taught a very distinctive teaching that your descendants can suffer from your bad karma or your demerit. This is really at odds with the original teaching of the Buddha, where each sentient being has their own karmic account, and you can't kind of inherit that from your ancestors. However, this shows probably a Confucian influence, the idea of the importance of the family line, the lineage. And so partly you are accumulating merit not just for your own sake, but for that of your descendants as well. And also you can have a share in your ancestors, either their sin, their shame, or their demerit, or their merit. So there's a kind of a collectivization of good and bad karma here, at least in the family. He had many Confucian followers, which shows you that, Confucianism, even though there were attacks by these Neo-Confucians on Buddhism during the Song and Ming dynasties, many people in practice combined traditions. So most of the scholarly class, the Ru, they were Confucian, but some significant fraction of them were also interested in Buddhism. And you can see as well how the idea of the family lineage being important would have been appealing to a Confucian audience. Another thing worth mentioning is that Jesuits, who were Catholic missionaries, were active in China during this period, the 15 and 1600s, and their goal was basically to convert everyone to Catholic Christianity. Now, it did not happen. They did have some converts, some success, and there are populations of Catholic Christians in China today, some of whom I believe date back to this period. Others were converted more recently. But the point is, the majority of the population actually did not convert to Christianity. They retained, the traditional three religions: Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, either one of those or some mix of them. So finally, there was the infamous White Lotus Society. This is an example of a kind of highly syncretic cult or sect in China. These have arisen actually going back to ancient times. You can see early versions of this type of thing in the Han Dynasty. And they often combine beliefs from different religions, and the ones that are called cults or regarded as troublesome tend to get involved in politics or try to establish their own sorts of political structures and mechanisms of control outside of a central government. The White Lotus Society specifically originated in the 11th and 12th centuries as a movement ruled or governed by lay people, not monks, but dedicated to Amitabha. So it started as a Buddhist sect. However, they did have clergy that were not celibate. Now, this goes against, a pretty basic rule for Buddhist monks. Celibacy is one of the fundamental principles, but there have been some sects of Buddhism, not only in China, but also Korea and Japan that I know of, that have non-celibate clergy. This was definitely an innovation. You can see that partially this is just trying to reconcile Buddhism with the importance of family life and Confucian values in Chinese culture. They also incorporated some ideas from Taoism, like practices to maintain your health and longevity through cultivating your qi. They also were Buddhist millenarians. So Buddhist millenarianism is when Buddhists sort of focus a lot of attention on the coming of the next Buddha, Mile, which is the Chinese name for Maitreya. Now, all Buddhists, Theravadins and Mahayanas alike, believe in Maitreya, who will be the next Buddha. This goes back to the Pali Canon, but they don't all equally emphasize not only worshiping him, but the idea that he's going to be back soon, we need to prepare. So it's similar in some respects to Christians who believe that the coming of Jesus, the second coming, is imminent. Buddhist millenarians believe the coming of the next Buddha, Mile or Maitreya, is imminent. And so partially they can connect this with their attempts to gain political power. They might think that they're playing some crucial role in bringing back the next Buddha and thus saving the world. The White Lotus Society was operating partially in secret because they were rebels against the Yuan or Mongol dynasty. And their machinations did actually help overthrow the Yuan. However, they were suppressed by the founders of the Ming Dynasty, who regarded them as troublemakers. And the reason why I have this goofy picture on the right is because they're sometimes used as villains in Chinese martial arts film, which oftentimes have bad guys that are sort of like some weird, obscure religious sect or cult that are up to no good and sort of like conspiring against society, etc.